Hello and welcome to this bonus episode of the Content 10X podcast. I'm your host, Amy Woods, and I am delighted to bring to you this special bonus episode going out on Tuesday, May the 12th, which is Giving Tuesday. Now, as part of a campaign during May to celebrate all things giving, of donating, volunteering, acts of generosity, on Tuesday the 12th of May, there's a special movement in the podcasting community for us podcasters to record bonus episodes to give shout outs to podcasts that we listen to and that we highly recommend, and really just give a shout out to a wonderful podcaster. Now, I was really happy to do this as somebody who has a podcast, but also who has a business that serves podcasters and works in the podcasting industry. Podcasts giving shout outs to other podcasts is probably something that we don't do enough of. And people often ask me, what do I listen to? And I'm equally intrigued as to what other people listen to as well. So I'm really happy to put this bonus episode out, and I'm really looking forward to listening to other people's bonus episodes to see what they recommend and what they listen to as well. So to my fellow podcasters, why not consider recording a similar podcast episode yourself, a bonus episode for today, Tuesday, the 12th of May, and just give some shout outs to the podcasts that you recommend and listen to. And the hashtag to use on social media in relation to this and to find out more about what's going on in relation to this is Giving Tuesday Podcast. So hashtag Giving Tuesday Podcasts with an S on the end. Okay, so let's jump in. So when I was trying to decide how I should go about this, I thought I would share, firstly, podcasts that I just genuinely do listen to. So not podcasts that I necessarily recommend for you as a content creator, whether you're trying to improve yourself in podcasting or video creating or business overall. I'm going to come on to that in just a moment. I've got some kind of quick bonus recommendations in relation to that. But I firstly wanted to start with just genuinely letting you know the podcasts that I do listen to and why. And they are related to health, I guess, health and well-being. The second one's a bit more fitness related. The third one's a bit more business related. But they're podcasts that you listen to and get to hear fascinating conversations that you'd never ever normally get to hear in life other than through this wonderful medium of podcasting. Now, the first one is called Feel Better, Live More by Dr. Rangan Chatterjee. And I just really enjoy this podcast because of the fascinating conversations that you get to listen in on. Rangan gets wonderful, wonderful guests on the show. And episodes are on all sorts of different topics, from things like how we can sleep better, our brain health and how our brains work, how we can improve our mindset, how diet affects our lives, how stress affects our lives, how we can learn better techniques to breathe better and how breathing affects our lives, and just so much more. It's really, really, really interesting. And he gets true experts on the podcast. And even when it seems like a topic that I may not necessarily have chosen, I may look at the title and think, I'm not sure if I'm interested in learning how to breathe better through my nose. But then you listen to the podcast episode and you're like, wow, that was so insightful. So that's the kind of podcast that this is. And I just really recommend it. Feel Better, Live More by Dr. Rangan Chatterjee. And I'm even going to go one step further and let you know what my favourite episode is of this podcast. It's episode 91, and it's called If This Man Can Turn His Life Around, So Can You, with John McAvoy. And it's a really long episode, 2 hours and 43 minutes, which sounds crazy. I listened to it probably over 2 or 3 car journeys on 1.5 speed, so it didn't take up that much time. But I listened to that episode 91 of this podcast. If you only listen to one, it is absolutely fascinating. And it's not actually about health as such, it's about overcoming adversity. And at this time during the pandemic, I couldn't think of a better podcast episode to listen to, especially if you're, worried, anxious, and wondering how you're going to overcome the challenges at the moment. Then you have to listen to this podcast episode. Okay, so number 2, the next podcast that I recommend is the Model Health Show by Sean Stevenson, a fantastic podcast. And I guess you could say that it's similar topics to the Feel Better, Live More podcast, things like stress and diet and exercise and sleeping better, breathing better, all those kinds of topics, medicine, brain health, mental health, really varied, but all about making sure that people live the best life that they can live. But I'd say a difference with Sean is that he really digs into the science of it all, which I find really, really fascinating. He does really extensive research into the topics that he discusses with his guests. So they really do go deep. And I think that's what I really enjoy about this podcast. Now, I nearly shared a stage with Sean Stevenson, a Youpreneur Summit in 2019, and then something happened and I don't really know what, but Sean moved from talking in 2019 to talking in 2020 instead. So I was gutted that I didn't get to meet him as a fellow speaker in 2019, but I still can't wait to go to that event to meet him in 2020, of course, if the event can go ahead. So yeah, he's a really great guy, really great podcast. That's the Model Health Show by Sean Stevenson. And again, I'm going to recommend a podcast episode as well. So episode 408 called Master Your Focus in Turbulent Times and Unlock Your Limitless Potential with a guest called Jim Quick. And that was absolutely fantastic. So if you're going to start anywhere, really recommend episode 408. So the next podcast that I recommend is called Impact Theory by Tom Bilyeu, and you spell Tom's last name Bilyeu. This is a really popular podcast, as is Sean's, as is Rangan Chatterjee's. Tom's really well known, and it's a weekly interview show that explores the mindset of really like the world's highest achievers. So he has some incredible guests on the podcast, and what Tom's all about is understanding their mindset and understanding how they have used mindset in order to help them to succeed, and the tools and the knowledge that they use to unlock their potential. So he's all about unlocking potential, and he believes in everybody having this potential and they just need to learn how to unlock it. So I really love this, just as somebody who's always looking to improve in all aspects of life, in business, in fitness, in health, with relationships, with family. I really like this. I've only recently started listening to it, and ironically it was because he was a guest on Rangan Chatterjee's Feel Better, Live More, and I really loved what he had to say as a guest. So I thought, wow, if he has a podcast, I'll go and listen to his podcast. And I've just been listening to more and more of his podcast, digging into his archives as well. So really recommend that. Impact Theory. And a podcast episode that I really recommend that I listened to recently, just the other day actually, is episode 168, Russell Brunson on the secrets to surviving severe economic downturns. Tom had such a great conversation with Russell Brunson. I actually went back to certain points and listened to it again because I thought some of the points that were made by both of them really related to where I'm at the moment with things that I'm doing with the business. And Tom's podcast also goes out onto YouTube as well. So listen to it on a podcasting app or head to YouTube and watch the interviews, because he records the full interview and puts the full video out onto his YouTube channel as well, which is also Impact Theory. Okay, so there are 3 podcasts that I really recommend that I listen to at the moment. Now I want to give a shout out to some specific podcasts that are more niche down and I know will help listeners to this show who are content creators. Okay, so number 1, it is the Podcast Accelerator hosted by Mark Asquith, who is CEO of Rebel Base Media and a really good friend of mine as well. Now, I'm not just saying this because he's a friend. This really is a great podcast for anybody who is a podcaster. If you are thinking of starting a podcast, or if you have a podcast, whether it's in the early stages or really quite established, this show is still really, really useful for all those levels. So Mark puts out episodes 3 times per week on a Monday, Wednesday and a Friday. They're short form, so they're only about kind of 8 to 10 minutes long. And it can be anything from tips and advice on how to record podcasts through to things like monetization, through to marketing and how to grow a business out of your podcast. And he shares things like how to understand podcast analytics and what analytics will be important to you, through to what equipment to use. It's absolutely fantastic if you're starting a podcast. For example, when I started the Content 10X podcast, I really just wanted one reliable source of information that I could trust to help me on that journey. And Mark's podcast did exactly that. But even if you are an established podcaster, he also shares his reactions to podcasting news and industry insights that people outside of the industry just don't have that level of information. And Mark's very giving and very sharing and just letting you know the things that he's seen behind the scenes deep in the podcasting industry. So there you go. Starting a podcast or have a podcast, then check out the Podcast Accelerator by Mark Asquith. Okay, so next up is the Membership Guys podcast by Mike Morrison. Now, I really, really recommend this to anybody who has a membership site, who is thinking of starting a membership site, or has any kind of online business that brings in a recurring revenue type model. This is such a fantastic show. Now, Mike is a friend of mine too. He's also a client of ours at Content 10X, but that's not why I'm recommending this show. I'm just really blessed to work with people who have fantastic shows. But Mike puts in so much into every single episode. It's just jam-packed full of practical advice, as well as kind of strategy level information and tips and advice on planning, creating and then growing a really successful membership. And there's nobody that I think anybody should learn this from other than Mike and Callie, the Membership Guys. So that's their podcast. It's got the same name as their business and their membership. It's the Membership Guys podcast. So do go and check that out. Okay, next up, and this is for those of you who like to go live on social media or you are interested in doing more live streaming, and it's the Confident Live Marketing Podcast hosted by Ian Anderson Gray. Now, this is for people who really want to level up their impact and their authority through the power of live videos. So live videos I mentioned on social media, but also live webinars and podcasts as well. Ian teaches people how to just be more confident, and he also helps with the tech and the gear and the overall setup and everything else. Camera fear, he can help you overcome that. And he also interviews lots of people who are doing this and asks them really great questions on how they overcome fear, how they are confident, how they've developed their live show, and also, the results and the impact of having a successful live show or having successful live streams. Now, we're sponsors of the Confident Live Marketing Podcast, but again, that actually is not why I'm recommending this. I'm recommending this because I don't actually think there are many podcasts out there that teach you how to just be confident in going live and how to do live streaming. And I've said it so many times on the podcast, I think live streaming is such a fantastic opportunity for repurposing, because when you have live video, you can repurpose that into other video content, you can repurpose it into quote graphics, into blog posts, you can strip the audio and turn it into a podcast episode, and so much more. And when you live stream, you're creating an experience for your audience, and you're building a community through live streaming as well as creating content. So it's more than just content, it's an experience too. But it's not easy, and I think it is the most challenging form of content that most people are scared of, and Ian just really, really helps you. So that's the Confident Live Marketing Podcast with Ian Anderson Gray. Now, my next podcast recommendation is the Standing Ovation podcast hosted by Jay Bear. If you are a speaker, or if you are interested in becoming a speaker, or to be honest, if you just love hearing fascinating and often quite hilarious stories, then you are going to love Standing Ovation. Now, Jay is a client of ours here at Content 10X. He is the founder of Convince and Convert. He's also a Hall of Fame speaker and EMC, and he's one of fewer than 200 living members of the Professional Speakers Hall of Fame. I saw Jay speak at Youpreneur Summit in 2018 when he delivered his Talk Triggers keynote, and he is an incredible speaker. And he launched the Standing Ovation podcast, which is a podcast where professional speakers tell the stories of their stories. Whenever I see speakers present, the ones that really stick in my mind, the ones that make me think, wow, that was an incredible talk, an incredible speaker, are the ones that share these amazing stories that stick in our minds and really manage to hit home on what they're trying to teach you and what they're trying to communicate, but through the power of storytelling, and they take you on a bit of an experience too. So on this podcast, you hear the truth about storytelling and the speaking business at large. He invites some of the most experienced professional keynote speakers. And as I've started to do more speaking, it fascinates me as to how you get to that level and how you can share stories in the way that these top speakers share stories. If you are a speaker, or if you're interested in speaking, or if you just do any presenting at all, so I don't think this is just for speakers, this is for anybody who presents information to other people and recognises the importance and the power of storytelling, then you should definitely listen to the Standing Ovation podcast. And also, it is just really entertaining and really, really funny as well. So whilst we work on this podcast, we produce this podcast and do all of the marketing and repurposing for the podcast, it is absolutely no choice chore to listen to it. I listen to this for pleasure in my spare time because it's such a great podcast. So really, really recommend it. The Standing Ovation podcast by Jay Bear. And there's one last podcast that I want to mention, but last but certainly not least. And it's really great that it's Giving Tuesday. And this podcast celebrates its 100th podcast episode on Tuesday, the 12th of May. And that is the Treasury Career Corner podcast hosted by Mike Richards, who is CEO of the Treasury Recruitment Company. Mike is a good friend of mine and he's a client of ours at Content 10X. And we have been working with Mike from the very start of his podcasting journey when it was just an idea through his launch to working on all 100 of his podcast episodes. Now, this is a great example of a podcast that is super niche down. It is for people in the treasury industry. Mike interviews CEOs and treasury professionals from all over the world about, well, not recruitment as such, but about their treasury career. And it's for people who want to learn more about that and want to progress in their treasury careers. So I want to just say a big shout out to Mike on congratulations for episode 100. It's not easy to plan, record and publish 100 podcast episodes 100 weeks in a row. So congratulations, Mike, on episode 100. Okay, so there you have it. That's my podcast recommendations for Giving Tuesday. We have Feel Better, Live More by Rangan Chatterjee. We have The Model Health Show by Sean Stevenson. We have Impact Theory by Tom Bilyeu. And then we have The Podcast Accelerator by Mark Asquith. The Membership Guys podcast by Mike Morrison. The Confident Live Marketing podcast by Ian Anderson Gray. And Standing Ovation by Jay Bear. If you like this episode and you want to share these tips and recommendations on what to listen to with other people, then please do get involved in what's going on social media. Shout out about it, tweet about it, Insta story about it, Facebook post about it, and use the hashtag Giving Tuesday Podcasts. And also a little bit of an ask from me too. If you enjoy the Content 10X podcast, then in the spirit of Giving Tuesday podcasts, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a review on whichever podcasting app you listen to, because reviews do really help to make a difference for getting the podcast noticed and in front of more people. So all that's left to say is thank you so much for listening to this week's podcast episode, and I'll catch you in the next one.